Welcome to the National Press Club and welcome to this Lowy Institute conversation with Stephen Biegun. I'm Sam Roggeveen, Director of the International Security Program at the Lowy Institute, and as is customary, we begin by acknowledging the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet. Over the next hour, we'll discuss President Trump's views on foreign policy, trade, alliances, international negotiations and American power, but we'll try to dig beneath the surface too to ask, what are Trump's core foreign policy beliefs? What does he mean when he talks about America first? How can history and context help us to better understand President Trump? And we'll also talk about what's on your minds, because I'm going to leave plenty of time for questions from the audience. But let me first introduce our guest. Stephen Biegun has more than 3 decades of international affairs experience in government and the private sector. He was corporate vice president with both Ford Motor Company and the Boeing Company. As the State Department's second-ranking diplomat, Mr. Biegun oversaw the full breadth of national security and foreign policy decision-making, reporting to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo in the first Trump administration. And he was the Trump administration's chief North Korea negotiator in that eventful period, and I promise you we're going to get to that. He also worked on US-China relations, the Indo-Pacific, US-Russia, Eastern Europe, and arms control. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please welcome Steve Biegun. Steve, thanks so much for being here. I want to start by reading out a statement from President Trump.
Okay.
For decades, Japan and other nations have been taking advantage of the United States. The saga continues unabated as we defend the Persian Gulf. And Trump describes the Persian Gulf as an area of only marginal significance to the United States for its oil supplies, but one upon which Japan and others are almost totally dependent. Why are these nations not paying the United States for the human lives and billions of dollars we are losing to protect their interests? The world is laughing at America's politicians as we protect ships we don't own, carrying oil we don't need, destined for allies we won't help. Allies who won't help. Now, the interesting thing about that statement is that it's dated from 1987. You know, a full-page ad that Donald Trump, then property developer, placed in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, and I think the Washington Post.
Correct.
So what, as a first question, Steve, that is remarkably consistent worldview on first appearances. What does it tell us, not only specifically about his views on the Persian Gulf, but about Trump's worldview generally, about how he sees the world?
Well, thank you, Sam. And before I respond, let me also thank the Lowy Institute for generously hosting me over the last almost 2 weeks here in Australia. I've had a chance to see quite a bit of your country on this, not my first visit, but certainly my longest visit. And after a series of meetings and events in Sydney, we've been in Melbourne, in Adelaide, where I had a chance to visit Osborne and see the progress on the AUKUS infrastructure. And then here in Canberra until tomorrow, and then we'll head back to Sydney. It's been fantastic, and I want to thank you and Michael Fulalove and the Lowy family for supporting my visit. Truth be known, Sam and I conspired on that opening anecdote because Sam has heard me in some of my discussions today with various foreign policy experts here in Australia, and also with some of the officials with whom I had the privilege to meet yesterday and today, that there are certain dimensions of President Trump's foreign policy that are predictable. For a seemingly completely unconventional and unpredictable figure, there are consistent themes that the president has valued in international relations, and many of them trace back to the 1980s. And I think that's a very important starting point to understanding our president. Long before the world was thinking about Donald J. Trump, Donald J. Trump was thinking about the world. And it isn't just found in his views on there's several Trumpian themes woven into that anecdote. There's the resentment about allies who are shouldering an insufficient amount of the burden in the relationship. There's a insinuation of unfair trade and economic practices, singling out Japan, which at the time was in trade circles was the real boogeyman for U.S. trade policy, very much dated to the 1980s. And of course, it is anchored in the struggle you see manifesting in President Trump's policies today related to the war with Iran, the war in the Persian Gulf, where there's both it repels him and attracts him at the same time, that there's a job to be done, and he's resentful that the United States has to do it. But in this case, certainly in the context of current events, he feels compelled to do it. And this isn't the only region in the world, and these aren't the only topics. Much of the way our president thinks about Russia, for example, can be found in the things that he said and did, the meetings that he had in the 1980s. A little known that in the early 1990s, businessman Donald J. Trump offered his services to Ronald Reagan's White House to negotiate arms control, the START treaties, on behalf of the United States. President Trump had a confirmed belief that arms control was fully negotiable, and it was the incompetence of the negotiators that was preventing a successful conclusion of these talks. And that's very much frames how he looks at negotiations. President Trump has the conceit of the negotiator that everything is negotiable, but not everything is negotiable. You see in that period how President Trump understood that great leaders, like President Reagan at the time, did big and important things with Russian leaders or Soviet leaders. And I think you can see how that imprinted on his approach to Russia, even in the midst of a brutal Russian invasion of Ukraine. President Trump sees accommodating the United States and Russia as an achievement that great presidents do. President Trump wants arms control treaties. I'm absolutely confident that in the course of his presidency, we will hear much more on this topic as he approaches both Xi Jinping and at some point, perhaps, Vladimir Putin on the issue of arms control treaties, because important presidents have arms controls in their legacy. So there's a lot in the past that President Trump was thinking and saying when he was just moving past building his successful reputation as a businessman in the city of New York and really beginning to turn his attention to the global stage. There's another thing that happened in the 1980s that maybe goes unremarked, that he visited the state of Iowa in 1987. No figure of American profile in politics or around politics visits the state of Iowa a year in front of a presidential election without signaling that they're interested in being the president of the United States. They will claim they're simply visiting an old friend or responding to a dinner invitation or just happen to be passing through town. Any politician whose footprints show up in Iowa within 12 months of a presidential election is thinking about running for president, and I think in 1987 it's quite clear President Trump was.
By the way, a neat little footnote here to that is that in 1987, when Trump placed that ad, it was reported in the Associated Press, and the journalist writes here, asked if Trump's letter had anything to do with political aspirations, his spokesman said, right now, Donald Trump has no ambition to seek political office of any kind.
Right now.
Now, by the way, I was also remiss in my introduction in not thanking Rothschild & Co. for the sponsorship of Steve's visit. They're a fantastic supporter of the Lowy Institute, so I do want to say a sincere thank you to Rothschild & Company for sponsoring the Distinguished International Fellowship, which brings Steve to us. So now, Steve, you've talked about some golden threads that run through Trump's worldview all the way back to 1987 and before, strong consistencies over time. Another thing I've detected in your comments over the last week or so is that you think Trump's behaviour on the world stage is also consistent with some older trends in American statecraft. So, for instance, stuff that we've, I think, forgotten about, but for instance, Greenland is not just a personal preoccupation of President Trump. It's something that goes back, that has a history among many administrations, and certainly American interventions in Central America of the kind that we just saw earlier this year in Venezuela. That has a long history in American statecraft too.
Yeah, so this goes for anybody, but it goes especially for President Trump. His understanding history and context are important to having some ability to predict, or at least anticipate what policies might arise. And I can tell you, as somebody who's been a student of and a participant in American foreign policy now for 4 decades, there's nothing new under the sun with President Trump. There's not a single element of any policy that he's advocated for that can't trace back to some other period in American history. Not always periods of history which are our proudest moments, and in some cases modeling values that today might be very different than what we might seek in our elected leaders, but anchored in history nonetheless. So, Sam, you mentioned Greenland, and here I did address this. This was mentioned in my public comments in Sydney about a week ago. President Trump is the 4th United States president to seek to acquire Greenland from Denmark, dating back to 1867. Those of you who have had a little bit more exposure to American foreign policy will remember 1867, so set the stage. Abraham Lincoln has been assassinated. His successor is President Andrew Johnson. But Andrew Johnson, having taken over in emergency circumstances, keeps intact the cabinet that he inherited from the deceased president. And his Secretary of State is a name that's known to many Americans, William Seward. Seward was an ambitious Secretary of State who looked for opportunities to grow the size of the United States territory through acquisitions. And so he first approached the Russian Empire, and he offered the Russian Empire $7.5 million for the Russian Empire to sell the United States of America the territory of Alaska. The Russian Empire was more than happy to get rid of the territory. They were looking for a buffer between themselves and the British Empire, which had dominion over Canada, having just lost a war in the Crimean Peninsula to the British. They didn't want any more of that. They wanted a buffer, and they happily sold Alaska to the United States. Now, Seward, with his appetite whet, next approached the Kingdom of Denmark, and he proposed to the Kingdom of Denmark that the United States would buy the island of Greenland for $5 million, and the Danes agreed. But Andrew Johnson, Abraham Lincoln's successor, was so loathed by the United States Congress. He was such an offensive personality that out of spite, they refused to appropriate the $5 million to allow Seward to consummate the deal. That would have spared us all the turmoil of the last few weeks. Seward wasn't done, incidentally. If he had gotten Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark, his next approach was to the British Empire for Canada. But with Canada, he was going to make them an offer they couldn't refuse. With bookending it with Alaska on one side and Greenland on the other, Britain would likely have little choice but to meet the price that the United States was willing to pay. And that was just the first president. The second president was President Woodrow Wilson. President Woodrow Wilson's Secretary of State, Robert Lansing, was directed to seek to buy the Kingdom of Greenland the island of Greenland from the Kingdom of Denmark, because Greenland posed a point of approach for European armies to get into North America. There was a strategic imperative now, as well as an economic imperative with rich fishing grounds. And so the United States approached Denmark a second time and offered to purchase Greenland, but this time Denmark said no. At the same time, the United States sought to buy a separate piece of territory from Denmark. It was called the Danish West Indies, which some of you might know of. Today we call it the U.S. Virgin Islands. The U.S. Virgin Islands were the Danish West Indies. And what the Danes agreed to do is they will sell us the West Indies because we wanted them to guard the approach to the Panama Canal, but in return we had to recognize their sovereignty over Greenland. And so the United States did. in 1916, the United States recognized Denmark's sovereignty. By the way, we were far from the last country to recognize Denmark's sovereignty over Greenland. Norway took much longer than us because Norway had claims dating back to Eric the Red in the year 1000, which they relinquished with great reluctance, and so on and so on. President Truman, World War II, the Nazis actually did intend to use Greenland as an approach to the United States of America. After the Nazis occupied Denmark, the Danish ambassador to Washington, exceeding his authorities because he didn't represent a government anymore, his government was exiled, he turned over to the United States full liberties to establish a military presence on the island of Greenland to prevent a Nazi takeover. And the United States sent military forces there that never left to this day. And finally, in the early 1950s, with the formation of the new NATO alliance and Denmark an ally, Denmark and the United States reached an agreement to incorporate the defense of Greenland into the collective defense of the NATO territory. And the United States kept its troops there and continuously has had a military presence on Greenland since that day. President Trump is the fourth president. Aggressive, threatening, very typical of the president's oftentimes bombastic style, but nonetheless attaching himself to a thread that traces itself back in American history over 160 years.
So a number of continuities there, but you'd also have to agree that there's been dramatic change inside the Republican Party in your lifetime. I think I've heard you say that you joined the Republican Party as a young man, inspired by the example of Ronald Reagan, who was president at the time, and he was a figure of great, I mean, quite apart from any policy differences, he was a model of public propriety and manners, courtly manners, if you like. If you had to summarise it, what would you say has changed in the grand old party, the Republican Party, over that time, and what's changed in America?
So our parties today are, I think, best described as coalitions. There are deep differences in different factions inside the parties, and certainly in the Republican Party, there's no one faction that has a majority. There's parts of it that are louder, parts of it. There's certainly the president's core MAGA support has a plurality of the Republican Party, but the president doesn't get 77 million votes in November of 2024 without tapping into the economic libertarians, to the social conservatives, to the national security hawks, the different constituencies inside the Republican Party. The Democratic Party is very likely very much has the same splintering and the same coalition nature, but it's not fully on display yet. It will be as we approach our next election in the fall, and you'll see real battles between progressives on the left and the center left inside the party. The center left will say that the progressives are unelectable. The progressives will say that the center left represents an old style politics that doesn't energize the voters. It's going to be a debate that's, I think, is going to be recognizable to people who live in a democratic society like Australia. But on the Republican side, certainly one manifestation of that is in the foreign policy space, and there are some at least foreign policy positions that have been staked out, or at least rhetorically laid out. But I don't think those actually have so fundamentally changed Republican foreign policy, because quite honestly, this current conflict with Iran would be very recognizable to me as somebody who started in Washington, D.C. when Ronald Reagan was the president. And I think several presidents may have contemplated even going this far. There's a problem with Iran's nuclear weapons pursuit has been with us for 25 years now. And
of course, the Lebanon, the bombing of the Marine barracks happened under Reagan.
Yeah, so I mean, the friction between the United States and Iran traces back to 1979. But likewise, you tell me Nicolas Maduro was snatched out of his bed in Caracas. I'll give you Manuel Noriega in Panama under George W. Bush, or Ronald Reagan some of this is recognizable. There are two things that are new. One is President, and by the way, the other thing I think we can say is definitively has been settled is that President Trump is not an isolationist. I mean, there's nothing that you can attach to the foreign policy behavior of this administration, especially over the course of the last 3 months, that could be remotely connected to isolationism. But what the president does do is shows a forward-leaning use of American power. He's got a willingness to use power, almost at times an eagerness to use power in a way that would have been treated with much greater reserve by his predecessors, partially perhaps out of fear of unintended consequences, partially out of uncertainty for what the outcome might be, partially perhaps for a lack of public support, congressional support, or the support of friends, partners, and allies around the world, none of which is readily evident in the course of this Iran war. I'd also say that just because you had popular approval to do it, and just because you had a congressional mandate to do it, and just because you had dozens of allies willing to join you in the undertaking, also doesn't guarantee success. I give you the 2003 war in Iraq, which had all three: public approval, congressional support, and allied participants. So we'll see where that goes. But there's something else that's happening that isn't really about President Trump or the current Republican Party, which is there's been a coarsening of our public debate in the United States of America. And that's larger than a single political party, Republican or Democratic. Mm-hmm. And that's the part that I think many Americans are uncomfortable with, is the incivility that has penetrated into our politics. And that's not to say every era of American politics has been civil. Our Civil War was the most uncivil period of American politics. In the lead up to that, one elected member of Congress beat another elected member of Congress to death with the knob of his cane on the floor of the House of Representatives. The incivility is not entirely new to our politics or to anybody else's. Just upstairs, I was looking at a picture of your former prime minister speaking to an angry group of citizens who felt that their gun rights were being challenged in a previous decade. And you could see in the outline of his suit the flak jacket he was wearing as he addressed a crowd of Australian citizens. So I'm not telling you anything that is unfamiliar to you in the stretch, even in the reach of your history. But that incivility right now, combined with some of the fundamental changes in the parties, is creating a very unsettled political environment, and one that I think many of us hope to see off as quickly as possible.
All right, so we've touched on Iran already, but let's go to the heart of the matter. What I'd really like to ask you is whether you think the US did the right thing in launching this war. And by that I don't mean, did the administration go about it the right way? There are certainly criticisms to be made about the lack of consultation with Congress, with allies, and with the American public as well. But what I mean is, was the war justified by the scale and the extent of the threat that Iran posed?
Yeah, I'm convinced it was. Mm-hmm. I certainly can allow that other people have a different view. And there's no guarantee this is going to turn out well either, I might add. So two things can be true at the same time. This might have been the right thing to do, and it may not turn out well. And I'm not here to give you a bedtime story. This is not going to be an easy conflict for the United States of America. This is the largest adversary the United States has gone to war with since World War II. This is a country of 93 million people. Iraq was 40-some million people. It's 4 times the geographic territory of Iraq. It had a near nuclear weapons capability. It had a sophisticated ballistic missile capability. It has proxies that will fight on its behalf in several neighboring countries. Most recently, we've seen eruptions in Lebanon and in Yemen. The United States has de facto, if not de jure, been in a state of war with Iran since 1979. There are dozens of incidents of attacks, virtually all of them launched by Iran or Iranian proxies against U.S. interests. You mentioned the terrible bombing of the Marine barracks in 1984 that cost the lives of hundreds of United States Marines who were in Lebanon in a peacekeeping capacity to try to separate the warring sides in the civil war. But any number of other terrorist attacks over the years, either motivated by the Iranians seeking some kind of concession, or as a response to an action elsewhere in the Middle East that the Iranians wanted to signal their discontent with. Iran in 1968 signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty forswearing pursuit of a nuclear weapon. They have demonstrably violated those commitments. They subsequently withdrew from the Non-Proliferation Treaty. They made the judgment that pursuing a nuclear weapon would make them safer. It is in the interests of the world for the Iranians to understand that that makes the world less safe for them. The Iranians' ballistic missile capability posed a threat to the entire region of the Middle East. They were destabilizing it from afar with the reach of their ballistic missiles. They were destabilizing it internally through the sponsorship of proxy organizations across the region. The United States first acted to address that in January of 2020 when it attacked Qasem Soleimani, the commanding general of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps. Qasem Soleimani was personally the author, the designer, the funder, and the sponsor of the IED explosives that were smuggled into Iraq as we and our allies were trying to bring some stability to post-Saddam Hussein Iraq. Those weapons were used to kill and maim hundreds of soldiers, many Americans, many from other countries around the world. That was the direct work of the Iranians, of Qasem Soleimani, and the United States responded to that. So for this litany of reasons, and as a conservative Republican who thinks that there is an appropriate use for power in the world to address issues like this, I think the president made the right decision. How is going to be whether how it's gone about is going to be successful, and ultimately what the outcome is, are still very much in debate.
Well, that brings me to the follow-up question. So you've described in some detail the threat that Iran has posed over many decades, but I think you'd agree with me in saying that another metric for deciding whether a state should go to war is whether they have a realistic belief that they can win. And I just wonder where you are on the scale of optimism and pessimism on that right now. And I want to quote to you in that regard Gideon Rachman, the Financial Times International Affairs columnist, his latest piece, and I'll quote him now. In fact, Western military planners are very pessimistic about the chances of reopening the Strait of Hormuz by military means alone. That leaves a negotiated agreement with Iran as the most realistic option. But Iran is likely to demand a very high price. The Iranian regime has its eye on a potentially game-changing future revenues, as well as a means of dispensing favours or punishments to countries all over the world.
Yeah, so what I would tell Gideon is that's one of a range of possibilities. It's not impossible what he describes, but I'd also tell him not so fast. You know, I don't love war, and it is regrettable that with Iran it got to this point, but it can't be separated out also from the depredations they're imposing upon their own people through 3 successive popular uprisings, most recently in January of this year, where credible estimates suggest that no less than 7,000 Iranian civilians were gunned down, unarmed civilians protesting the government were gunned down in the streets and squares of Iran, and possibly more than 30,000 through brutal repressive tactics. None of this can be separated out from the current context. Now, I certainly, for analytical rigor, we could come up with a lot of potential scenarios, and Gideon's a thoughtful and smart writer, and he lays down one that's a real risk. But I'd also say not so fast because, I think about in 1991, the United States went to war to force Saddam Hussein to relinquish his hold on Kuwait, to push Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. It took more than 40 days for that campaign to deliver the capitulation of Saddam Hussein in 1991, and that was with a coalition of 60-plus countries and 500,000 ground troops in the region. In 1999, Serbian dictator Slobodan Milosevic was undertaking a brutal campaign of ethnic cleansing against the ethnic Albanian population of Kosovo. And the combined forces of the NATO alliance used airstrikes in order to force him to end the depredations of the Kosovar people. It took more than 70 days before he capitulated. And so we're on, this war began on February 28th. I think that puts us at somewhere around 35 days here today, give or take a day. I don't know the exact math. We don't know how resilient the Iranian government is. We don't know how much they have in reserve. We know that their nuclear weapons complex has been destroyed. They still possess the enriched uranium that they've previously produced. We can see the evidence in open source photography that their ballistic missile production facilities have been completely destroyed. They still have some reserve of ballistic missiles, clearly, that they're firing, but the rate of firing of projectiles against other countries in the region is now down well over 95% from the first days of the war. They have the very dangerous and pernicious Shahed drones, which they produced in large volumes and may have warehoused for use, episodic use. That's a worry. But I think we have to be careful not to make the Iranians, we can't be overconfident, but we shouldn't make them 10 feet tall either.
Right. No, I absolutely agree. And it's clear that, as you say, the ballistic missile threat has been reduced, the threat from Iran's proxies around the region has been reduced, the nuclear program has been degraded. So the Iranians presumably are asking themselves, well, what's left as a point of pressure, as a point of deterrence? And obviously one of those is to close the Strait of Hormuz.
Mm-hmm. Which they've done.
Yeah, and which they can now keep closed on their own timeline. Which
has generated the echoes of President Trump's 1987 full-page ad that he's complaining. I do think I think we have to give this some time. I do believe there is going to be significant effort to reopen the Straits of Hormuz through a protective naval presence, and I also think we're going to see a diminished capabilities on the Iranian side, but still the instability will be there because in these things we have to be right every time, and they only have to be right one time. They can disrupt the entire flow of shipping through the Straits of Hormuz with one successful strike against a tanker. The insurance companies will react, the shipping companies will react, the crews and the captains of these ships, of course, will react. So 100% secure Straits of Hormuz without some settlement in this conflict is probably out of reach.
Right.
And so we'll see. It's also, I think there was a lot of eagerness in President Trump's original expression around why this war began to have regime change in Iran. And as you've probably seen in the last day or so, the president is claiming we've successfully achieved regime change, and that is true in a technical sense, that it's the same regime, it's just different set of personalities in the regime. But this is another reality that'll be very hard to reach. Gideon may be right, but having a new Iranian government take the place of the one that exists now is a long way off as well, because there is no, by design, there's no organized and nationally popular opposition that would be capable of taking power again. I mean, I could present a more optimistic scenario that's not perfect, which is that there's a figure like we saw in Venezuela, the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, who comes in and is willing to more or less abide by the wishes of the rest of the world, or in this case, also the United States and Israel, to take Iran in a different direction. And the old regime, some version is allowed to remain in place, kind of Iranian revolutionary regime 2.0. I think President Trump would probably grasp at that possibility as a successful outcome. The problem is that there are other interests at stake here, including the Israelis, and I'm not sure the Israelis are going to be excited about Iranian Revolutionary Government 2.0. And so there's going to be a lot of sorting out that has to take place no matter which one of these. The Gulf states won't tolerate a permanent Iranian threat laid out by Gideon.
Won't tolerate. But what would they do about it?
Well, interesting question. They could do one of two ways. This war could expand and get worse. They could determine that we've passed a point of no return, and they simply have to join in delivering on regime change, regime behavior change, at least in Iran. The other possibility, which would not be a surprise in that region of the world, is a very transactional approach to find an accommodation with Iran, which may actually involve some kind of agreement to even share financial benefits with the Iranians in exchange for opening the Straits of Hormuz. But there's so many moving pieces right now. Right. To call it today and say this is how it's going to end, I think is just very premature.
Okay, so final question from me before I open it up to all of you is just to connect all of that, Steve, with our region. Although actually maybe not strictly our region, it's a global issue really, and that is nuclear proliferation. Surely one lesson that America's adversaries are taking now, and that any middle power would take from this episode, is that what happens to you if you're striving for nuclear weapons but you don't have them is that you are vulnerable to attack. But if you do have them, like North Korea does, if you race towards them, like the regime did in North Korea, where you had so much experience, then you're safe. So could we interpret this episode as being a prompt towards further and faster nuclear proliferation around the world?
We have a nuclear proliferation problem, period, and there are other things that are going to fan the flame of proliferation, including the creeping legitimization of North Korea as a nuclear weapons state, which inevitably will have an impact on decisions in places like South Korea and Japan about whether to pursue their own nuclear weapon. Questions at times about America's reliability as an ally and the certainty of America's extended deterrent, our willingness to allow our nuclear weapons to be used as a deterrent on behalf of our treaty allies. If that comes into question, it's going to spur an appetite by countries to control their own security, to control their own fate by having their own capabilities. The one place that I'm not particularly worried is in the one you describe, for the following reason. Countries like Iran don't get the nuclear weapon as part of a reasoned process of determining their security. In the case of North Korea, it was a direct consequence of the overwhelming conventional capabilities that threatened them. They needed an asymmetrical response. In Iran, the pursuit of the nuclear weapon was intended as leverage, not as a deterrent. Mm-hmm. The Iranians walked right up to the edge of having a nuclear weapon, what we call threshold nuclear weapon status, but then sought to leverage that for room for maneuver geopolitically in the region, and also in order to buy time and space for the regime itself, not to have a nuclear weapon per se. And it's because I think the Iranians in the back of their mind knew what the consequences of that would be. And in a sense, they gambled with it too long, because I hope the lesson that this actually sends, which is equally possible, is pursuing a nuclear weapon outside international law poses a greater danger to your country than a deterrent. It does less to protect you and more to endanger you. Yeah. And in my negotiations with North Koreans, I told them that from the perspective of American. We lived every day of the Cold War with the prospect of a nuclear weapons attack against our own country. Even today, one can't rule that out. And that was despite the fact that we had our own massive deterrent. Mm. And one of the things in my negotiations with the North Koreans that I unsuccessfully, but nonetheless I tried to convince them, was that the nuclear weapons actually may make them less safe, not more safe. They've made their mind up. It's clear where they're going. But in the case of Iran, I think it was part of the reason why Iran is under attack today.
All right, so please, ladies and gentlemen, there's a microphone roaming around. Please put your hand up and tell us who you are and your question, please. Yes, at the back.
Hi, my name's Hamish Ross. My question for you is, do you think President Trump has any clear war aims in Iran? And where, if met, he would say, okay, we're done with this war. And if so, what do you think they are? Thanks.
Yeah, so I mentioned earlier that there are long-standing priorities, even urgent priorities, that have driven both America's military as well as its diplomatic policies in relation to Iran. And it's Iran's nuclear weapons program, its ballistic missile program, and its destabilization of its neighbors. In 2016, President Obama, working with some of America's closest allies, negotiated a diplomatic agreement for the Iranians to pause their nuclear weapons program, which the Iranians were in agreement to do through 2026, so through this year. So just to give you a sense of how short that agreement was, had it continued uninterrupted, it would be expiring this year, the JCPOA. That agreement, by the way, the Obama administration tried to put into that agreement, it tried to introduce into that negotiation controls on Iranian ballistic missile programs and also destabilization of the neighbors, and the Iranians just flat out refused. But part of the hypothesis of President Obama's administration around the JCPOA was that if we buy some quiet in the relationship, if we get a pause, a freeze in the Iranian programs, and a period of calm, if we begin to unwind some of the sanctions that have been in place, that'll create a positive momentum in the relationship in which we can then maybe expand the diplomacy to engage on the issue of ballistic missile programs or possibly Iranian efforts to destabilize its neighbors through proxy organizations. But the Iranians evinced absolutely no interest in doing that. In fact, to the contrary, the Iranians accelerated their ballistic missile program during that period, and they deepened their efforts to destabilize their neighbors in Iraq, Lebanon, in Gaza, in the Palestinian territories, in Syria, and became a full participant in Bashar Assad's brutal war against his own people. President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA in 2018, but I lay 100% of the failure of that agreement at the feet of the Iranians who missed the opportunity that was given to them. And those reasons are the same reasons that have driven us to this war today. President Trump's objectives, in his initial social media post, it was regime change. It has gravitated to these longer standing U.S. concerns of the three issues that I mentioned. And I think some redress of those has to be achieved by the president in order for him to be able to credibly say this war achieved its objectives. In the case of the nuclear weapons, that very well may mean either Iranian forfeiture or U.S. seizure of Iran's enriched uranium that's buried somewhere deep under the ground in one of these destroyed facilities. In the case of ballistic missiles capabilities, the president, I think, can credibly claim that we have destroyed the current capability of the Iranians to reconstitute their ballistic missile threat. But absent a binding agreement that the Iranians promised to abide to, it's very likely that someone's going to have to go back and mow the lawn once in a while, so to speak, that the Iranians will try to rebuild these factories. Like they did with their nuclear weapon, they may try to do it underground or in secure facilities. And I don't think that brings us to a definitive conclusion on the ballistic missile threat. And then finally, on the regional destabilization, I think I think how the Trump administration will likely characterize that if they do in fact declare that they've achieved the outcomes that they sought in this war, is that the economic degradation of Iran has made it impossible for it to devote the resources that it previously had devoted to funding the development of militia groups in neighboring countries. That is how I could foresee the Trump administration saying that it's achieved its objectives. And as I mentioned earlier, the president has already said he's achieved the objective of regime change. Is that going to pass the credibility test? I'm not here to sell you anything. That's going to probably be a pretty imperfect outcome.
Can I ask you about, Steve, about the mowing the lawn point? Surely the objective of Iran's closing of the Strait of Hormuz is to prevent something like that in the future. They are looking now for a new basis upon which to deter Israel and the United States. So they've taken out the proxies, they've taken out a lot of the ballistic missiles, they've hit the nuclear program. What have we got left? The Strait of Hormuz. And so the Iranians are now, one interpretation, it seems to me, of their behaviour is that they're signalling to the US and Israel, if you try this again, we will create this much more economic pain for the world.
Yeah.
So that cuts out the mowing the lawn option.
They've been explicit in it. You're right. One of the demands that the Iranians were presented with demands for a potential negotiation to end the war, and they countered with their own demands. And one of their demands was the United States and Israel forswear permanently to never attack Iran again for exactly that reason. Right. So that is in essence nibbling around the edges of exactly what you're describing, is that we will continue to threaten the Straits of Hormuz until you no longer threaten us. We'll see.
Indeed. Okay. Jen Parker in the front row.
Thank you so much, Stephen. Jen Parker. I'm a non-resident fellow with the Lowy Institute. I guess the question I want to ask you is a bit about President Trump's comms strategy. So I agree. I think this intervention with Iran was necessary. Whether it was necessary now relies on intelligence that I don't have access to. But I have a lot of empathy right now for my former mentor, Brad Cooper, who is the commander of CENTCOM, because what I watch is a military campaign with clear objectives undermined by statements by the president. And so I guess what are your thoughts, or how do you grapple with his comm strategy, and how should allies respond to that?
Yeah. So I think President Trump's comm strategy is, so I heard someone else describe it recently as block out the sun, to consume all the space in the communication space. Now, you're absolutely right. It consists of contradictory messages, telegraphing what we might be doing next. And I suppose the only salvation is that oftentimes there's so much misdirection and so much inconsistency in it that it would take a pretty discerning listener to identify which strategy is likely, and that also would be in defiance of the unpredictable nature of the president. But I do think, I have said this during my visit here and a couple other sets of addresses. He is the most transparent president that I in the 40 years I've served in government, is that he makes the policy in public. It is a constant rolling conversation with partners and allies in other countries, with the American public, with the media, with adversaries, signaling, messaging, using social media. It's unorthodox, it can be unsettling, but it is extraordinarily transparent. And so, when you're a policy maker inside that communications environment, you sometimes, hear the new policy the same time everyone else in the world does. In a social media post, when I was negotiating with the North Koreans, don't think for a second that every tweet that came out was a product of, here's what we should say, here's what the president should say. It goes up the system, and then the president does it. The president would just say it. We wouldn't even know it was coming. I had somebody on my team who had to set their phone to the president's Twitter feed so we would know what the president said that day on the issue. We were ostensibly tasked with addressing in the negotiations. But something else I have to add to that, which is my fear when I first took the job was this was going to be deeply disruptive to our diplomacy. But in fact, in time, what we figured out how to do is use it for leverage. And when the president would make a point that would help advance our negotiation strategy, we would amplify it. And it would have the gravitas of being anchored in something that the president had publicly expressed. And so, I think about the CENTCOM commander. So the president, from the very beginning, and his administration said, under no circumstances will we send ground troops into this war. But now we see thousands of American Marines have arrived in the Middle East and are positioned to potentially be used in a ground war. And you think your mentor friend who had CENTCOM is struggling with the communication strategy. They imagine what the Iranians are struggling with here. Is the president going to use ground forces? Is he not? Is he using it for leverage to bluff us? That unpredictability cuts both ways. Yeah.
He's very transparent. Another way, perhaps, of saying that is that he's shockingly honest, oftentimes, but he also lies a lot, doesn't he?
Well, it depends on the definition of lie. He certainly tells the best version of any piece of information that would be beneficial to him. I've been involved in American national security and foreign policy for 40 years. If President Trump told a lie, he wouldn't be the first president I've worked with to tell a lie, and I trust it goes the same for others too. As the old saying goes, the definition of a diplomat is a fine gentleman sent abroad to lie on behalf of his country.
Right.
It doesn't excuse, and by the way, not to make too light of it, in issues as grave as war and peace, communications precision, and honesty with the public who's sending their sons and daughters to fight in wars is an imperative that is non-negotiable. But in the information space, there's also just a lot of noise, and distinguishing between what is a dangerous misrepresentation of the truth or a lie, and what is intended to keep an adversary guessing or unsettled is in the eye of the beholder at times.
All right, who would like to go next? Right at the back there. If you could just wait for the microphone.
Thank you. Prue Gordon from the Australian Centre for International Trade and Investment. Thank you for your presentation. You clearly articulated some of the continuities between this administration and previous administrations, but one area where I hoped you might comment was on some of the domestic US institutions that might normally be considered having in their interest constraining the action of the president. So, for example, the Congress seems to have been either supportive or unwilling to really push back against the president. We've seen his active attacks on the free press in the US and his whole fake media narrative. We've seen his attack on the legal system in the US, on universities in the US. I'm just wondering if that active attack on these institutions is something that differentiates the Trump administration from the other administrations you've mentioned.
Yeah, I would distinguish between the institutions that govern our country, and then there's the informal institutions like the free press, like civil society. I'd also say it's not an institution, but there's an important element, which is democratic culture, because I think one of the things that I've learned in time is that democracy is secured by its institutions, by its laws and constitution in many cases, but democratic culture is also necessary to make the system work. It's not necessary to defend the system, but it's necessary to make it work. And I think democratic culture is under threat. The unwillingness to accept an electoral defeat is a rebuke of democratic culture, and I think that weakens the ability of the system to function. But in terms of, I'll disaggregate this a little bit, but in terms of the formal institutions of government, I I have an unquestioned confidence in our institutions enduring, regardless of whatever momentary challenge they might face from any president over time. And that's because the genius of our founding fathers was to design a government that didn't work well because it was populated by wise and good people. It was to design a government that worked despite the fact that we are weak and avaricious and power-seeking as part of our human nature. And so the institutions don't survive because they're populated with good people. At times they survive despite the fact that they're populated by not so good people. I would distinguish between Congress and Congresspeople. Congress's authorities are intact, and any future Congress, and we have a new Congress every 2 years, any future Congress will find those powers intact. The willingness of a particular set of elected officials to use those authorities, notwithstanding, the authorities are intact, and the Congress has enormous authority in our system. The courts do. The issues when presidents, and President Trump is not the first president to exceed the reach of presidential power, but when they do, the other institutions are self-correcting. You take tariff policy, for example, where the president took liberties with what the Constitution endows to our first branch of Congress, the executive branch of the Congress, our first branch of government, the Congress. The president exploited and used that authority until the courts stopped him. And it's a slow process. It took months for the courts to make this determination, but then the president has lost the ability, based upon the ruling of the court, to use tariffs in that way. And so therefore, the institutions performed. Now, in the informal institutions, what we call the fourth estate, the media, which is a core part of our democracy, media, the state of the American media is not entirely healthy, but it's less so for any attacks or criticisms of politicians, and more for the struggle that the media has in adapting to a new information environment, one that's challenged us in many, many more ways than simply through the traditional media in the fourth estate. It's challenged us in how we communicate with each other. And how we receive news. It's affected our children. I watched the very important debate that played out here in Australia this past year on the use of social media by minors. We're wrestling with the same issues, and I suspect this also is partially responsible for that coarsening of American society and the incivility that I'm describing that are themselves contrary to democratic culture. We've atomized ourselves as a society where we only will congregate with people who share our views, and we increasingly divide within those groups into narrower and narrower groups adhering to differences that are exacerbated and amplified by the constant pummeling of information that we're getting through today's technology. That is a bigger problem than any president of the day. And that's a societal issue, and one that I know your country, that Australia is trying to take on, and one that we need to as well. And it's much bigger than the president.
All right, we have time for one more. This gentleman in the middle of the row here.
My name is John Angley. My question is about influence on President Trump. You provided a great context. He's often accused of repeating or being persuaded by the last person he spoke to. Could you just give an idea of, is the influence of Prime Minister Netanyahu greater than usual on the president, and who in the administration or near the administration is the most influential person on the president?
Yeah. So I served in the first term of the president's administration, and I'm not, I don't think I'm close enough to the inside qualified to answer your second question. But on the first question, I've seen disagreements during the first term, during my time in office, between President Trump and Prime Minister Netanyahu, and the president is fully capable of disagreeing with Netanyahu, and we may very well find ourselves in a situation where the imperative for President Trump is to bring this war to a conclusion and reopen the Straits of Hormuz, and that doesn't match the imperative that the Israeli Prime Minister feels. I know there's a lot of caricatures about the outsized influence that Israel has on American foreign policy. But I have to say those really are caricatures. America and American policymakers are fully capable in every day think independently about their issues, but Israel does play a special place in American foreign policy as a longstanding ally and partner in the Middle East, but also tracing back to the shared experiences and awareness we have of what the Jewish people endured in Europe 80 years ago. Does that give full license to Israel to act in any way or manner that it seeks? I think you see frequent course corrections. There were tensions in Gaza that ultimately led to the United States to take ownership of the diplomacy and at least cool the level of fighting in Gaza after the threat from Hamas had been demonstrably addressed. And there are places where the United States will sometimes act, and I would argue even act in a way that might save Israel from some of the decisions that their own politicians, within the constraints that they have politically, might otherwise make that would be damaging to the interests of Israel. Gaza's one. The end of this war in Iran may very well be the next one looming on the horizon. There is ample evidence, ample independence of action on the part of the United States government, because it is often aligned with Israel, is not predictive of the outcome every time.
All right. Ladies and gentlemen, that takes us out for the hour. As always, on behalf of the Institute, thank you so much. We're humbled by your support of the Institute's activities and for finding the time to join us here today. Please keep an eye on the website for future Lowy Institute events, but for the moment, could you please join me in thanking Steve Biegun?
Thank you.